In this video, I'll tell you about the ugly phase, what it is, and why it might be stopping your hobby motivation. I'm still waiting on the refurbished windows at my studio where I usually film. The most recent ETA that I've heard, I think it was just today, actually, this morning, is probably near the end of May. Hopefully. I guess we'll see, right? So until then, I'll still be filming here in my office at home. In the miniature painting hobby, whether it's painting for tabletop play or, very fancy painting for display, or maybe even like painting competitions, there's always things that can kind of get in the way of you finishing your projects and, hitting your goals. Obviously, sometimes it's just regular life stuff that gets in the way, like work, family, health, or sometimes even just other hobbies that can pull you away from finishing your miniatures. But sometimes it's something that's usually referred to as the ugly phase that can stop your forward momentum. You might have heard the term the ugly phase when kind of referring to miniature painting, but if you haven't or you just don't know what it means, I'll explain it. The ugly phase is a kind of disheartening period in the miniature painting process, or really in any kind of artistic, process, I suppose, where it's not the beginning, where you don't really expect it to look like anything yet, right? And it's not the finished product where you expect it to look, like finished, right? Instead, it's the middle part, and your mind will play tricks on you if you let it. Miniature painting is a process, obviously. If you've ever seen even a single miniature painting tutorial, then you know that generally you do everything kind of step by step in the process of painting the miniature. Also, these steps really can't be done out of order much either. You don't glaze before you prime the model. You don't edge highlight before you base coat a part or something like that. These things. You generally follow things in order in miniature painting, mainly because miniatures are painted in layers from the lowest to the highest, and layers are kind of important to build up over the process. The problem is this. There's usually a lot of steps to the process. Depending on how fancy you're getting with your paint job, there can be hundreds, if not thousands of different steps. Like if you were doing like a really big kind of diorama project, for example, then maybe thousands of steps. And early on, you expect the project, the miniature, right, the terrain piece, whatever it is you're working on, to look unfinished. I mean, you just started, right? But as you work more and more on the project, your brain starts to assume that the model should probably start looking better as well. The issue is sometimes the painting process isn't what you perceive as gradual improvement, right? It's a bunch of different steps that all move towards a common goal, a finished model, but while each step actually does move you closer to done, they sometimes don't look like they've moved you any noticeable amount closer to your goal. If you spend an entire painting session, let's say, working on a model or, a group of models or whatever, but at the end of that, maybe 2 or 3 hours of painting, the models don't look like that much different, that can be the ugly phase. As a comparison, baking is a very step-by-step process as well. Things need to be done in a specific order, and if you don't do it right, it just won't turn out. My wife enjoys the Great British Baking Show, so I've seen plenty of processes in baking that haven't worked out, and, plenty that did. But in baking, there's certainly an ugly phase, right? Like, it's dough, right? It's usually throughout the entire process, that ugly phase, until kind of the very end, when it's a thing, right? But no one is usually put off by this. It's part of the baking process. You generally don't expect to eat the thing until the end when it's finished. But painting generally takes longer than baking. It can take sometimes weeks to get some painting projects done, like if you're going real hard into display painting and things like that. Whereas baking is generally a lot quicker. You might bake all day or maybe overnight even, but that's about it, right? Therefore, the ugly phase is a lot shorter in baking than it can be in miniature painting. The much longer ugly phase is what can cause you to stop kind of working on that painting or even building, whatever project altogether. So how can we make it so that the ugly phase doesn't stop our hobby progress? Miniatures that don't seem like you're making much progress are usually not much fun to look at. This is kind of a bummer and can kind of knock the wind out of your sails motivation-wise when you're just starting out as a painter. If you've been painting for a while, you generally understand this problem and work through the ugly phase. They usually call it trusting the process, and you just kind of have to silence that part of your brain that's reacting negatively to how the model looks now and kind of keep thinking about the future. But it doesn't always work. Even people who've been painting for as long as I have, and I'm old, and there are people who've been painting even longer, sometimes we get thwarted by the ugly phase ourselves. Besides just trying to get your mind to sort of trust that process and look forward, there are a couple of other tips that I can share with you to help you better get through this, hopefully. The first one, I honestly don't ever do myself, but I know some people who swear by it. It's generally against the way that I paint, but you might want to have a look at it. Basically, the idea is that you focus on one part of the model, like a single leg or the head or something like that, right? And paint that part to a completely finished state before you even start working on the rest of the model. I never do this myself, but you've probably seen work in progress photos like this before. It'll be like a primed model that's just like black or something like that, but nothing else is painted yet. But then it has like one leg that is completely and perfectly finished. Fancy non-metallic metals and the whole lot. The amazing Flame On Miniatures is a master of this from what I've seen, and I'm amazed by the commitment. The benefit to doing this, I assume, is that you get one small part of the model to a finished state quicker, since you're not trying to get the entire model to the end state at the same time, right? Then your mind is kind of got a finished leg or arm or whatever to look at while you tackle the rest of the model piece by piece to get all of those parts to the same finished state. I feel like this is more used by the display painter folks than the tabletop painters or army painters or whatever, but I think I've seen some tabletop painters do this as well. Lately, what I've been doing is trying to make big changes to a model quickly to make it look different and kind of knock myself out of the ugly phase. What do I mean? Generally, I mean painting the base, at least with a simple base coat and maybe a wash if I want to, before I have the model even close to being finished. I frequently will do the initial base coat on a model with my airbrush, like on this One Page Rules Saurian here. I airbrushed him with some Army Painter airbrush paint, and then I did the metals with a brush, a normal brush, an Aztec Gold metallic speed paint, also from Army Painter. But now he's mainly a big green lizard standing on a big green base due to the overspray, from the airbrush, or a rattle can if I had, done the model like that way. You've probably had models like this in front of you before where the entire model and the base are all one color. Now, yes, he does have some gold accents on the metal parts at this point, but that's a lot of green right now. All that green being there on the model and the base for the foreseeable future can kind of start to have some real ugly phase vibes to it. And usually I paint the base last, so the ugly phase will be a problem for a while. But what I've been doing, and if you've been watching me on Twitch, you've possibly seen me do this, is painting the base early. So he's no longer a big green lizard standing on a big green base until nearly the end of the project. He's a big green lizard standing on a big gray base earlier on in the project. It seems really simple, but it's actually a quick win earlier on in the process, and it separates him from the base in your mind, like visually, and just seems to help with the ugly phase. I don't completely paint the base early on. I usually just put a simple color over it and maybe a wash for now. I'll do the dry brushing and the rest of the finishing on the base at the last step, because when I dry brush the base, I do generally like to get a little bit on the model's feet and stuff like that to sort of tie them into the environment. But getting that base to not match the body, it really does help. So if just simply trusting the process doesn't work for you to help kind of combat the ugly phase, which can lessen your hobby motivation, then hopefully one of these other ideas will be the trick that keeps you going through. Do you ever run into the ugly phase on your models? Does it kind of stop you cold, or do you use one of these techniques to get over it? Or do you have a different technique, a different way to get through the ugly phase? Let us all know down in the comments below. You could help a fellow hobbyist by putting some information down there that they're going to pick up and enjoy. If you liked this video, hit the like button as well. It helps to kind of get the video out to more people, and I appreciate it. Also, subscribe for a new video every single Friday, and thanks for watching.